All right, so in this video, we're going to be talking about ideograms. And one of the things that I want to do on this channel is to talk about words and the etymology of words and the origin story of words, because you learn so much history and so much about culture just by understanding where certain words came from. And I thought, what better place to start than the word ideogram, because that is how we describe some of the most original forms of words and of communication. So that being said, the word ideogram is actually derived from two Greek words, idea, which translates to idea, basically. I'm sure the Greeks pronounce that part a little differently than I do. So idea, and then grapho, which means to write. So it's Greek meaning to write an idea, which is exactly what ideograms do. And some of the earliest forms of ideograms were Sumerian Cuneiform, and then you had Egyptian hieroglyphs, and then you had Chinese characters, ancient Chinese characters. And it's interesting because when I was doing the research for this, and you look up the chart of the Sumerian cuneiform ideograms put up right against the Egyptian hieroglyphs put up right against the Chinese characters, they all look relatively similar. So I was very curious, okay, well, when did these all start to happen? So I have them written on my handy dandy note cards because I'm just learning this stuff too. But the Sumerian cuneiform, and an interesting derivative and explanation for the word cuneiform is a Latin and Middle French word that means wedge-shaped, because these little cuneiform characters were wedge-shaped characters. So the word cuneiform means wedge-shaped. Interesting to know. And the Sumerian cuneiform, Sumeria is now modern-day Iraq. Imagine all the way back to 3200 BCE in Iraq. You know, back then it was Sumeria, and supposedly the cuneiform was developed by Sumerian scribes as a way to log transactions and keep track of transactions. And they used to use a reed stylus and be able to print that into clay tablets. So that was some of the first forms of ideogram communication happening on clay tablets to keep track of transactions. Go figure. And then 100 years later, so in 3100 BC, you finally see, not finally, I mean, it's only 100 years on this timeline, that's not very long. And also, again, geographically, keep a close eye in Egypt, which is relatively close to Iraq, or, then it was Sumeria. So ancient Egypt and Sumeria were somewhat close. And 100 years later is when Egypt started using their hieroglyphs. The Egyptians started using their hieroglyphs. And the word hieroglyph is Greek derived as well, just like the word ideogram. And hiero means sacred in Greek, and glypho means an inscription. So basically a hieroglyph is a sacred inscription. And supposedly, according to the Egyptians, these hieroglyphs were invented by their well-revered god Thoth, which, again, I think it's kind of interesting to see, what our history pans out, because did Thoth really invent hieroglyphs, which look a whole lot like Sumerian cuneiform, or did the Sumerians travel to Egypt and impart some of their written language wisdom? And that's the thing, it's not technically a language. It's not, in the sense that it doesn't use an alphabet. Ideograms are little graphics of ideas and concepts rather than spelling out words from an alphabet to make a language. And then fast forward to 2650 BCE, and that's when the Chinese characters were being developed. And according to the Chinese origin story for this in 2650, there was a man, the emperor's historian by the name of Kendy, made the original Chinese characters. But again, if you look up, the supposed charts of the cuneiform relative to the Chinese characters, relative to the Egyptian hieroglyphs, they all look pretty similar. But then again, you could also think of it this way. I mean, if all of these ideograms are trying to depict the same thing, whether it be a fish or an arrow or whatever it might be, a fish and an arrow in one part of the world is probably going to look kind of similar to a fish and an arrow in another part of the world. But I'm still fascinated by how, how certain cultures and civilizations developed relative to others, and what knowledge they were privy to at what times, and how they gained that knowledge. And so this is me trying to scratch the surface of that. But again, in terms of the timeline and the geography, if Iraq and Egypt are relatively close and they got their similar form of, communication and documentation within 100 years, you have Iraq still here, and then all the way over here you have China. Like, China is 4 to 5 times the distance to Iraq as Egypt is to Iraq. And, it's over 1,000 years later that China was using these very similar characters. So that's the origins of an etymology behind ideogram, and all the different ideograms are some of the most original ideograms that were used. If you have any insights on this, because again, I like to see how it all fits together, go ahead and leave comments, because I want to keep learning more too. But either way, hope this was helpful and interesting, and I'll see you later. Bye.